Hello everyone, in this video we are going to pick up our introduction to heredity. So we will talk briefly about history of genetics. I will emphasize on brief because I'm not gonna, give you a long lecture on this is how it started. We're just gonna talk about some highlights that happened in the field of heredity. So I wanna go over some key hallmarks of genetics. So we're gonna be talking about those throughout the semester. And part of that is just to acknowledge that heredity was not always well understood by people. They knew that traits were obviously passed on, um, but there was a lot that was not known. So the whole thing about family resemblance, you don't have to be a scientist to know that there is, family resemblance that happens. And that's something that people can, notice. And um, but how that happens is not well understood. So it's obvious that children can look like parents, parents can look like children, siblings can look alike each other, or even extended families can often tell, their cousins or things like that. That's the obvious part. But what's not so obvious is why, what was actually happening to make that occur, to make that resemblance. So some ideas are kind of famous, but not so smart. So there's one, this is an example of one. So this was after a time when people understood that eggs and sperm were important. They probably had microscopes to be able to at least see those tiny sperms. And sperms are a lot easier to look at than eggs were. So because, you can obtain some semen and you can try to look for sperm in there, which is not possible with the eggs. So even though eggs are huge, um, but before we had surgery and ultrasounds and things like that, it was actually hard to know where the egg was. So you often didn't see them, but the sperm is found in semen. Semen is not that hard to obtain. So it was something easy to look at. So people realized that the sperm was important long before they realized the egg was important. So the idea came out that the sperm contained within it, um, inside the head of the sperm, there's a tiny itty bitty human being. And this was basically just like a seed. In fact, sometimes in old literature, you know that a way of speaking, you might hear a man's sperm referred to as seed, his seed, and the idea was that the seed would then implant itself in the fertile womb of the woman and then grow, and that basically, in this case, you can see that there's a lot of emphasis on the sperm as being important and no emphasis on anything in the woman being important other than the basically using her to make a human being like a soil, you could say. So this was in late 1690s, and this idea came about. So again, after microscopes, but before we really knew much else. So what's wrong with this idea? Well, obviously, it's completely ignoring the genetic contribution of a female. So that's not right. But we can see again that emphasis on how important a male was and less of a female. That's very cultural thing in Europe. In the 1690s, a lot of times men were more important and women were kind of treated like a property. So this idea kind of fit with that idea. So it was very typical at that time. And there's another problem with this is what about the next generation, the next generation? So it kind of already inside the sperm, it's, a male sperm. So it's already very tiny and they can develop over time, but it seems like, um, how in infinitely small, how can you put maybe 100 generations in there in the future, kind of stacking on top of each other like I don't know, Russian dolls or something like that. So that didn't make sense. You cannot have generations packed into the sperm. So it kind of didn't make sense. Then there was an idea of blending inheritance. Blending inheritance is the idea that children are basically a mixture of the parents. that it's almost like paint, right? Where one of the parents is represented by red paint, other one is white paint. You can just take that as an example. And the offspring would be a little bit of red and a little bit of white, and they'd be kind of pink because of the blending. So the idea that children would kind of somehow blending liquids or fluids between the two parents, when you look at the multiracial families, it can kind of look like that. It can kind of look like you have two parents, they have different skin colors, and the children seem like intermediate between those two skin colors. And that's how, you can say that's blending, but and if you remember, I showed you a picture of the twins whose skin colors were very clearly not the same. So if the things were always blending, the two parents, how did that happen, right? So that doesn't seem correct. It doesn't make sense. This could be possible. Um, so so basically the blending inheritance, the idea of blending inheritance is didn't really stand up to any further scrutiny. And obvious examples like those multiracial twins where they had very different appearances, even though they had the exact same mother and father, they showed that this is something more complicated happening here. It's not just a blending. So that's when in 1860, the scientist and a monk named Gregor Mendel came about. He's considered the father of the genetics, modern genetics. He basically discovered a lot of principles, a lot of things that we can use today about genes and genetics, how that worked. He worked with pea plants. It was his hobby to grow pea plants, and he was able to determine the law of genetics by following what happened with pea plants and how they would reproduce. So it turns out that almost everything that he did back in 1860s was absolutely right. And he was able to uh, follow basically the generations and kind of create the law of genetics that he came up with. So we still hold them true today. We hold them as a good starting place. We have since uh, learned that there's more that Mendel, of course, couldn't figure out, but we consider that as a starting place. So the scientists never, basically science experiments never really work that way where people get it 100% right the first time. It actually takes many, many, many years, but then he kept working on it. He made, basically, what he did was really good. In fact, the things that he was able to do were probably 30 to 35 years ahead of his time because he published his work and people were kind of like, whatever. They didn't really understand it. And then it wasn't for like 30 or 35 years later when people started studying cells and they started looking at chromosomes and traits, and that's when they rediscovered his work and they predicted how all that was happening. And he actually, uh, so people didn't realize the importance of his work during his lifetime. He actually died before that, so it was kind of interesting story. So basically, we'll talk about a lot about pea plants in this course. We'll talk about Punnett squares and what else we know about human genetics. And one of the things that came out was the idea that blending was not it. So he proved that blending idea um, that's not what's happening because he was able to do this with pea plants because pea plants reproduce really fast and they make lots of seeds. So he was able to start looking at big numbers of offspring. In humans, it's hard to do, right? So you don't have just two people starting to have babies and they make 100 babies. So if they do make babies, that's gonna be 18 to 20 years. You're gonna have to wait because before those babies can start having babies. So it's hard to see the things happening in humans about traits when you're dealing with something that's gonna make 2 or 3 generations a year if needed. So pea plants can do that. So basically you can see what has happened here. He had pea plants that made green pea pods and pea plants that made yellow pea pods. So he combined those two. He crossed those two plants. He noticed that all the offspring were green here. And then it looks like, so the green totally dominant yellow. And then he did a second generation. He produced a second generation, the green with the green of the offspring. And when he did that, the offspring were 75% green and 25% yellow. So in the next generation, he found that yellow came back out again. So that looks exactly like this yellow, basically. So it was still fully as yellow as original that came back after the first generation. And there was something about these things that was being passed on discreetly. It's not blending, because if this was blending, then maybe it'll look a little bit yellow, a little bit green. So the idea of human skin color looking like blending, it turns out that skin color tends to be a little bit more complex than just the color of pea plants. So we'll talk about skin color and how that works later in the semester and why does it appear like blending. So moving on a little bit, so after Mendel, he published his work in 1860s, 1870s. So there was Franklin, Watson, and Crick in 1953 who determined the structure of DNA. And there was definitely a political story there. Rosalind Franklin, who was a technician in the lab, obviously a woman back at that time, when women scientists were pretty unusual and they didn't get a lot of recognition, and with rare exceptions. So she was the one who actually did the work of something called X-ray crystallography, and that helped them determine the structure of DNA, but she never got credit for it. So they used some of her data and to figure out what DNA looked like. And so X-ray crystallography helped them determine the structure of the DNA, but they never gave her any credit. So when they published their work, she didn't get any credit. So on the X-ray crystallography, they could see the repeating pattern of DNA like this. So some exact angles, and they were able to create the structure from that. And the way basically they got Nobel Prize for that. They came up with the structure of DNA, but Franklin didn't get any credit for that. So she didn't get any recognition until later. And then for the discovery of DNA, but she did play a role in that. So all the credit went to Watson and Crick. And then later, now we recognize that Franklin also did a lot of work in that. So that's something, that's to keep in mind, but DNA is a genetic material that contains genes. So that's something that happened was unethical because she didn't get any credit. But the purpose of talking about DNA is we know the foundation for genetics is DNA. And that's how we pass on things from parent to offspring. And we're going to talk about a lot about, the complexity of it. But it wasn't until 1953 that we really understood what DNA was. And the genetic material we know, this is a famous, picture. You probably already know it's a double helix, and that's what contains the genes. Genes are often said to be responsible to make us what we are, at least partly. That's true. There are some things that are not 100% genetic, like your blood type. Your blood type is fully determined. Sorry, there are things that are 100% genetic, like your blood type. That is determined by your genes. And there are other things that in which genes and environment play a role. So the environment meaning what you ate, what your exposure to toxins is, what was your upbringing like? Did you have any trauma? Did you have any other things happen to you, right? So all those things are environmental. Basically, any influence on you that's not your genes collectively, they can be put together with the environment. That brings up to another conversation, which is, especially if you're a parent or a psychologist, probably heard about the term nature versus nurture. When we get into the behavior or other conditions, as well as the things that are not always clear, is when we start thinking about nature versus nurture, how much of it actually is nurture. Nurture means our upbringing, how we were raised, those kind of things. And it turns out most of the things that we are not sure about are like to have or likely to have both of those playing a role. So a lot of mental health conditions or disorders, maybe it, the way our brains work has it has an actual genetic component, and also has environmental component, the way things get passed on. Like intelligence has a genetic component to it, and then things like depression, Alzheimer's, those also have a genetic component, but it turns out that genetics aren't the only thing. So a lot of other factors can be involved. For example, if someone was abused as a children, they have a maybe higher likelihood of developing depression or something like that. So what we eat, what we do basically have a big role in those things. So those are some of the genetic components, how we live and how we are raised. Those are environmental. And we're going to talk a little bit more about in the next video.